Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Favreau. I'm the Director of Editorial Programs at the New Press, and I'm editor of this fascinating and extraordinarily important new book by Professor Gregg Mitman entitled Empire of Rubber, Firestone, Scramble for Land and Power in Liberia. We're here today to discuss the many implications of Gregg's work for our own times, and I want to begin by acknowledging and thanking the co-sponsors of today's conversation. First of all, Harvard's Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and also the Center for African Studies, the Center for the History of Medicine, and the Project on Race and Gender in Science and Medicine at the Hutchins Center, directed by Professor Evelynn Hammonds. I am thrilled to introduce today's wonderful panelists. We've agreed that I will only cite the brief version of their resumes, as a full accounting would take up all of our allotted time and beyond. The author whose work we are discussing and celebrating today is Gregg Mitman, the Vilas Research and William Coleman Professor of History, Medical History, and Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. An award-winning author and filmmaker, Gregg's recent films and books include The Land Beneath Our Feet and Breathing Space: How Allergies Shape Our Lives and Landscapes. Professor Evelynn Hammonds is the chair of the Department of History of Science at Harvard, the Barbara Gutman Rosencrantz Professor of the History of Science, and Professor of African and African American Studies. Among many other important and influential writings on the history of science, Professor Hammonds is the author of Childhood's Deadly Scourge: The Campaign to Control Diphtheria in New York City, 1880 to 1930. And finally, Dr. Paul Farmer is the Colocatrones University Professor and Chair of the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, Chief of the Division of Global Health Equity at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and co-founder and chief strategist of Partners in Health. His most recent book, one of many notable and paradigm-shifting publications, is Fevers, Feuds, and Diamonds: Ebola and the Ravages of History. Thanks to all three of you, and to our audience for joining us today. We hope that while this conversation unfolds, you'll throw questions in the chat. I'll leave some time at the end and pluck a few out of there, that space for our panelists to respond to. So I'll begin today by handing the mic to Gregg Mitman, who will offer a brief introduction to Empire of Rubber. Thanks, Gregg.
Thanks so much, Mark. And my sincere thanks to Dr. Evelynn Hammonds and Dr. Paul Farmer for their generosity in engaging in a conversation around the book, and to the sponsoring programs and departments at Harvard, as well as the Center for the History of Medicine at Countway and Harvard University Archives, which were so helpful in the initial research stages of the book. So I'm going to take about 8 to 10 minutes to just kind of give an overview and set up what I hope are some themes for discussion. Just by way of a kind of autobiography, I didn't set out to write a book about Firestone. Almost 2 decades ago, I was asked to serve as a scholar consultant on a film that was to be made on the roots of international conservation and colonialism. And the film never saw the light of day, but the focus was to be on a person by the name of Harold Jefferson Coolidge, who was a Boston Brahmin and Harvard primatologist. And as part of the project, they had unearthed footage from 3 different expeditions, one of which was a 1926 Harvard expedition to Liberia. And I'm going to share with you a brief clip of about 2 hours of footage that we have of this expedition, as well as around 600 photographs, which are now publicly available through a website we built, liberianhistory.org, in partnership with the Center for National Documents and Records Agency in Liberia and Indiana universities. So I take a moment here to share my screen and hit play. So the person taking the blood sample is George Shattuck. The man behind him who just took off his hat and wiping his brow is Planiano Bewolo. And the person who just entered into the frame is Max Thyler. George Shattuck came from a long family line of Harvard-trained physicians whose father, Frederick Cheever Shattuck, helped support the founding of Harvard's Department of Tropical Medicine in 1913. Planiano Bewolo was the son of a Crew paramount chief in Liberia who worked his way on a boat to America, was educated at the Mount Hermon School for Boys in Massachusetts, and then enrolled as an undergraduate at Harvard in the 19 teens, where he became a strong voice for the rights of Liberia's indigenous peoples at a time when the US was assisting the Liberian government in a brutal suppression of a Crew rebellion happening on the west coast of Africa in Liberia. Willy had helped to broker many of the arrangements for the 8-member team from Harvard. Sorry, just here. And it was led by Richard Strong, who's the gentleman seated second from the right, who also led the Department of Tropical Medicine. But Willy would be largely erased from the official expedition record, like many go-betweens in the history of science. Max Theiler would go on to win the Nobel Prize for the development of yellow fever vaccine. The expedition was a complete biological and medical survey of Liberia, undertaken at the very moment in which Firestone Tire and Rubber Company was trying to bring closure to a deal with the Liberian government for a 99-year lease for up to 1 million acres of land to grow a source of rubber free from British control. In 2012, through a chance meeting with Emmanuel Yapawolo Ure, who was at the time a Liberian graduate student at the University of Wisconsin and grew up on the Liberia-Guinea border, not far from where the expedition passed. Through Emmanuel, we began retracing the expedition in Liberia to try and understand the meaning and impact of Firestone and American science and medicine on people's lives and livelihoods in Liberia, which led to the making of the film, The Land Beneath Our Feet, that Mark mentioned, and to the writing of this book. Empire of Rubber offers a story of how a behemoth American company on a nationalist mission of profit, robed in beneficence, negotiated, maneuvered, and bullied its way into what was then one of only 2 sovereign Black nations on the African continent. Stepping outside America helps to make visible the structures of white privilege and power, buttressed by science and medicine, that drove the march of American capitalism and empire across the globe. But the story of Firestone in Liberia is more than a story of the white supremacy and racial capitalism that powered an American family dynasty for more than half a century. It is also a history of contestation, complicity, and resistance. The leaders of a struggling Black republic maneuvered to hold their ground to save Liberia from becoming an American protectorate. And at the center of that was Edwin J. Barclay, president of Liberia from 1930 to 1944, who was a master politician and diplomat and thwarted Firestone's plans for turning Liberia into an American protectorate. From across the African diaspora, Black activists, writers, scientists, diplomats, and business people rallied to support or oppose the experiment that was Firestone in Liberia. W.E.B. Du Bois, another Harvard alum, was one person who initially held out hope that white American capital, working, in his words, in partnership with Black educated men, both African and American, might create an industrial plantation of mutual dependence and prosperity like none yet seen. It all depended, Du Bois wrote Harvey Firestone Sr., whether the rubber magnet rejected or not the color line that shaped life in Jim Crow America. Du Bois would later regret his initial support, and within a decade, he became one of Firestone's most vocal critics. Firestone relied not on Black expertise, as Du Bois hoped, but looked to the places and people of white privilege and power that helped to build a Jim Crow enclave in a sovereign Black republic. And this is a photo taken in 1929 at Thomas Edison's 82nd birthday party. Harvey Firestone is on the far right next to Edison. Henry Ford is in the middle next to Herbert Hoover, who was just about to assume the presidency of the United States. Harvey Firestone was a mover and shaker in the Republican Party and would try and use his influence to take control of Liberia, including pleading with Hoover to send an American naval gunboat to protect his interests, although that never happened. Of the approximately 30,000 Liberians employed on the plantations in the 1940s, the majority were tappers, earning 18 cents per day. They were supervised by roughly 125 white managers, and the racial geographies visible on the 200 square mile enclave and embedded in the structure and management of the plantation workforce were greatly shaped by the racial attitudes of an American company and town. This is Akron and the main Firestone plant. On the Firestone plantations in Liberia, white management performed minstrel shows in blackface at the Whites Only Firestone Staff Club. This is the golf course behind the staff club in Liberia. Housing and healthcare for white management. This is white management housing and black laborers. This was Liberia labor housing was segregated, and medical surveillance of and drug testing on workers' bodies was routine. Outside the Jim Crow enclave of Liberia, outside the Jim Crow enclave of Firestone, Liberia did become a place of professional opportunity for African-American experts who would join Du Bois in their critique of Firestone. George Brown, for example, was an understudy to Carter Woodson at Howard University and would go on to pursue a PhD in anthropology and history at the London School of Economics. With support from his friend Paul Robeson, Brown undertook a brilliant study of the different economies at work in Liberia in the 1930s that highlighted the importance of land to Liberia's rural indigenous peoples and offered a prescient warning of the ways in which Firestone's plantation economy would reshape life in Liberia. Frank Pinder, the gentleman on the far left, was an ag extension trained at Florida A&M University. He worked as an extension agent under the Farm Security Administration in Roosevelt's administration, working to help Black sharecroppers in the US South. And then he would move to Liberia in 1944 and help to significantly expand international markets for Liberia's smallholder farmers in ways respectful of West African agricultural produce and traditions, offering a counter plantation model to development in defiance of Firestone. Yet the concession economy that Firestone planted in Liberia continues to shape Liberia's present. And this is a current map of concessions in Liberia. The color-coded areas are concessions, although the green are protected areas. In 2018, 50% of land in Liberia had been leased long-term to foreign corporations for agriculture, mining, and timber rights. In 2018, the Liberian legislature also passed the Land Rights Act, which for the first time in Liberia's history gives legal recognition to customary land rights held by the majority of Liberia's rural population. The law, if enforced, offers an important means for individual and community self-determination and protection from foreign land grabs that have shaped the country's history since the arrival of Firestone. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. We will move on to a question for all three panelists today, which is that Empire of Rubber tells the story on one level of the construction of a form of Jim Crow in Liberia in the service of a very powerful American corporation. So today, at a time of historical reckoning around race and inequality in the United States, what is the story of Firestone in all of its dimensions: empire, exploitation, theft, disease control, racial subjugation, and especially resistance? What does that tell us about our broader quest for accountability and understanding?
Greg has to start on that.
Okay.
Yeah. No takers.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll take a shot. So, one of the things that I think it tells us is we need to do a lot more work on the history of corporations. And I was trained as partly as an environmental historian, which is really a project about the history of world making. But I think there's been really an overemphasis on the importance of the state in making worlds. Whereas, if we think about the major actors remaking life and worlds in the 19th, 20th, 21st century, it's firms. Firms build worlds. They have been among the greatest forces shaping life in America. So part of that quest for accountability and understanding, I think, is to really look more deeply at how American corporations like Firestone, and also in conjunction with American science and medicine, successfully perpetuated racial inequality under the guise of humanitarianism and development. Yet, because they hold private archives, they have unique powers to control how they are remembered. So, for example, what we know about how big tobacco covered up the health effects of smoking, or how oil companies, sowed seeds of doubt about climate change science, only came through court cases that made those company records public in the process of discovery. Interestingly, Firestone has a large archives. They used to be at the University of Akron, a public university. It was clear from a pamphlet published by Harvey Firestone Jr. in the 1950s that established that archives, that he thought these were a really important resource for American business history. But to my knowledge, no one has ever been allowed permission into those archives. And then, and shortly after a lawsuit that alleged labor abuses on the Firestone plantations today was thrown out of court in 2011, my understanding was that Bridgestone Firestone, which bought Firestone in 1988, moved those archives from the University of Akron into a private warehouse. So they are now not available. And so, I tried to get access on a number of occasions to those archives, was unsuccessful. And it took me on a decades-long journey to try and tell this story from other sources. And I think that's why we don't, a lot of historians don't do corporate histories. But I think it doesn't mean that they can't be done. And we, if we really want to come to this reckoning of racial injustice in America, we really, really need to understand more, I think, the ways in which corporations, in conjunction with science and medicine, have really been forces in perpetuating racial inequality.
Well, for me, Greg, what kept going through my mind to think about the present through the lens of your story was there are three things. The first was the long history of Jim Crow and the ways in which, just as Brian Stevenson says, slavery didn't end, it evolved. The way the evolving nature of Jim Crow in its form over in Liberia, right? And then the second point being the ways in which structural racism is deeply embedded in medical and scientific practices, perpetuated by faculty members of one of the leading medical schools in this country, as late as they're going on with this in Liberia. We like to think we start the story about medical racism and we think it only, that by the end of the 19th century or early 20th century, it's, beginning to wane, and it's manifestly not beginning to wane. And then I think the last thing that your story raised for me was the role of African-American intellectuals and politicians, as well as critics like W.E.B. Du Bois, how long they had been making the same kind of critiques that we're trying to make today. And they were not heard and not paid attention to. But to me, it's very important to understand that Du Bois broke with supporting what Firestone was doing, the role of the philanthropies in that situation as well. So, African-American intellectuals and activists and scientists, as you explore, they were criticizing this the entire time. And there's no forum for them. And so I think in this moment of reckoning, we have to really understand, recognize that has always been a thread in our society. But I think the bigger one for me was the deep structural racism in American medicine and science.
Just to sort of agree overwhelmingly with Evelynn, that's how I got into this topic. I mean, technically, I would just say, I just want to say for the audience, Gregg and Evelynn, Mark know this. I never set foot in Liberia until the Ebola epidemic. So I came in as a clinician, long interested in Liberia, but not with any familiarity with the details. Certainly not the details of Firestone. And maybe that'll come up later in the discussion. But what because Liberia is one of the great clinical deserts of the world, even today. Although, there's always a chance to change that radically and quickly. And there have been chances in the past, often missed. I feel like Firestone missed a chance. But my real way and my other way in, which doesn't just date to the 2014 epidemic of Ebola that spread across Liberia. Before that, it was always through the Haitians. So, and, through the Haitian critique in the 19th century of even of African-American figures, but particularly obviously of white supremacy, colonial rule, et cetera. And there is a huge, it's said, and Evelynn would know the answer to this, Gregg too, that in the late 19th century, or even throughout the 19th century, Haiti published more books per capita than any of the places still under colonial rule in Latin America. I believe it. Mm-hmm. So I read all those things as a grad student, decades ago, and learned a lot from them. But I got stuck in the middle of this question that is central to Gregg's work and to this book and to this consideration is there is race and there is class. So the intersectionality of a lot of Haitian logic. I was and do still work in rural Haiti. So there's a lot of critique of Haitian intellectuals from rural Haiti, as there were critiques of W.B. Du Bois for these initial, who I always called Dubois, by the way, until I realized that I had picked up most of this in Haiti. And that's what really got me into this question was, how do race, class, gender intersect in a place like this? Mm-hmm. And so when we get to questions of a corporation, and I'd never, they're world makers, as Gregg said, but so are states, as everyone agrees. If you're not in the world of states and firms, and in the world of communities that have abundant critique, mm-hmm. Of how class is scanted in some analysis, race and others, that's kind of the way I came at it, sort of a Haitian way. Mm-hmm. And a rural Haitian way, if I can say, because there obviously was a lot of concordance between the Haitian intellectuals, the American intellectuals, Black intellectuals, I'm talking about, of course, and people in the diaspora throughout the world. That's how I came at it, which is a very fruitful way, Gregg, I think, to read your work. Not just this great book, but all of your work it's a good position, from a rural Haitian perspective. How would you look at a firm? And of course, firms have not penetrated rural Haiti, but they did penetrate rural Liberia. So I got into this through the Harvard expedition. And actually, the leader of the Harvard expedition might well be called my forebear, since I'm also a tropical medicine expert at Harvard. But there was a big divergence in the 19th century, really, with social medicine and tropical medicine. And again, that's not the subject of this discussion, but I know that Gregg is interested, and Evelynn, of course, has trained so many people to be interested in this. And that's where I got in. And so I found, as I often do when looking at archive-based research that goes right down to the nitty-gritty of freeze framing something from a film and saying the person just coming to a frame. So Gregg, I just wanted to say, for those of us still learning about Liberia after only a decade or less than a decade working in West Africa, this has been of tremendous importance to a lot of my colleagues to understand what's going on.
Thank you. I think the the Haiti Liberia comparisons are so important, you know, and that was very much on the radar of Liberian leaders when, you know, Firestone was coming in, because there had just been the American occupation, right, of Haiti. There was a lot of concern among Charles Dunbar Burgess King, the president of Liberia, when Firestone was trying to secure this lease, and then, of course, Barclay, about making sure that Liberia was not occupied in the way that Haiti was. So, you know, I really appreciate coming from that Haitian perspective, and you know, I think it was certainly very much on the minds of Liberians and among folks in the African diaspora community at the time, and the discussions. You know, Haiti came up many times in the discussions about, you know, this Firestone effort to secure this land. You know, and whether a corporation would be different than the state, because the State Department kind of took a back seat in some ways, although really worked behind the scenes. And another Harvard alum, William Castle, who was Assistant Secretary of State at the time, you know, really helped orchestrate a League of Nations investigation into slavery and forced labor in Liberia that Firestone was hoping to use to, you know, turn Liberia into American protectorate. Others hoped it would become a British mandate, but it was really, you know, and I think what you say too about the intersectionality of class and race is so important to the story in Liberia, because it's a country that, as I came to understand the dynamics, you know, it's an independent Black republic surrounded by European colonial territories who were always eating away at its boundaries, and you know, and it needed capital for development. It was severely in debt internationally, which is, you know, why the Firestone deal was appealing. I know Clarence Simpson, who was a Liberian statesman, said, you know, it was the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
You know, and so they went in knowing full well that this was a form of economic domination that could happen, but but they saw it at the time as the only way to really preserve their sovereignty. And yet internally, of course, there were these class dynamics of settler elites and Liberia's rural indigenous population, who had been there, you know, well before settlers came, Black settlers came from the U.S. and the Caribbean. And I think initially, you know, Du Bois didn't quite see that.
No.
That class dimension. He never went into the interior.
Yeah.
Right.
Which of course, and excuse me for interrupting,
No,
Greg,
please.
but I'm just saying, of course, that was the problem, or a problem of his astute take on Haiti, right?
Mhm.
His interlocutors in Haiti were the elegant and refined, and often nationalist, in a good way, Haitians. And, you know, so there seemed to be a kind of blindness around class there. And I never would dream to formulate that as a critique of W.B. Du Bois until I started reading more about Liberia. As one little aside that may or may not come up, the place that I still work today in Liberia after a tardy, you know, we, not me, who cares? I also, but I'm just saying I learned so much. So I ended up in the Americo-Liberian enclave on the border with the Ivory Coast, with Maryland County. And we're still there, of course, and we've been, you know, doing, that may be irrelevant to this discussion, but there again, you know, if you work there, you understand this great cleavage as a newcomer. I mean, obviously a historian knows it ahead of time, this great cleavage of class, so-called ethnicity, whatever you call it. In other words, the indigenous Liberians, which, you know, Haiti did not go through that struggle, because by the time of the Treaty of Ryswick at the end of the 17th century, when the western third of Haiti was ceded to France, there really were no indigenous people who survived at all. So they were gone. And in Haiti, it gets to be a different kind of discussion. It's all about class when I hear it from rural Haiti, whereas in Liberia, it was about class and whether or not you were an indigenous Liberian or not. And that was, a new experience for me as a physician, just to listen to that. Sorry, Evelynn.
I think that's really enlightening, and I think these kinds of fundamental differences about the role of the slave trade as it manifested itself in Haiti, the loss of the indigenous peoples there, and yet but this role of the firm to me is just awesome. It is so overwhelming, right? That the class issues play itself out with this sort of language of development and uplift and education. It's just all over the place, and it's all empty in so many ways. And so, the description of, the discussion about whether or not there was really slavery in Liberia with respect to the Firestone Corporation. I'm thinking, what kind of distinction are people making here? Of course it's slavery. It's just, it's at the barest, I don't know where the gradations come. It was, serious slavery versus not serious slavery or something. It was absolutely slavery. And these distinctions keep getting made across space and time, rather than seeing, instead of these sort of breaks. I think Paul is absolutely right to say, let's look at the sort of both distinctiveness and continuities that are being appealed to in the name of not even American imperialism anymore, but just in the name of American corporations and profits.
Something both of you brought up around, Evelynn, you talked about, the one of the prominent things in the book that stuck for you was the endurance of structural racism in American medicine and healthcare. And Paul, you've worked in Liberia, and you've referred to it as a clinical desert, and in Fever, Feuds, and Diamonds, you make this, I think, this really beautiful contrast between containment versus care, and that. Just for our audience members, I mean, it should be acknowledged that Firestone provided free medical care to its workers. It was very much. I gotta go get there. But and I interviewed women who came to work on the plantations, and we don't quite know when that happened. I think it was in the 1960s that began to happen, and one of the things they said to me was it was really not wages, because it was, even in the 1960s, people were earning 64 cents a day as tappers. But it was access to childbirth facilities, because maternal mortality rates are so high in Liberia. But as one of the things that we see is that the kind, other than childbirth, the kinds of primary care, as you never develops, and the focus is on all of diseases related to worker efficiency, so malaria and schistosomiasis, and the plantations become this experimental laboratory for these American researchers that are there testing experimental drug compounds. The white management are given a less toxic malaria drug than the Liberian laborers, because they weren't seen as able to transmit. The whites weren't seen as able to transmit, malaria in the way that Liberian laborers were, and so it really, fits into that containment versus care distinction that you make in Fever, Feuds, and Diamonds, and this kind of endurance of medical racism that you've written about and so eloquently, Evelynn. So
One of the things that as I know Evelyn's deep in this as well, and I'm sure you are, both of you. We talk about decolonizing global health, which we do all the time. I hope we do. One of the things we could really do, as Evelynn said, by saying care, is one thing that, where did the librarians learn this? Or meaning the elite librarians, or the people who signed the deal with Firestone, which again, I mean, one wonders, had you been there, what would you have done in the middle of a clinical desert with a labor famine? These are heavily colonial ideas, and whether or not they came from the settler Americo-Liberians or just from the encroachment of every surrounding part of West Africa, these are colonial ideas that we need to efficiently control disease to have labor to increase the productivity of our extraction. And so, these are, have been well delineated as colonial ideas. But one of the things that would be done in Liberia and elsewhere in that region, it seems to me, but across the continent and many other places, is one of the best ways to decolonize global health would be to actually provide care for the first time. Like, I mean, is safe motherhood the only thing we can do? They didn't succeed there either, but I'm saying even if that were the goal, that would still be insufficient, because human flesh is heir to all kinds of pathologies. And Liberia, we know from the Harvard expedition that you've written about, Gregg, was heir to all of them. I mean, it's a stunning list. And that I actually went out and I bought the 2-volume. I found it in a book sale. I'm like, they surely didn't mean to throw away these 2 original volumes, but I have them. I swear I'll give them to anybody here who wants them. But although I've marked all over it, I mean, the details in that 2-volume report, which was dedicated to Harvey Feinstein, are pretty remarkable. I mean, there was a disastrous situation there, as in the neighboring countries, but no better in Liberia than in Sierra Leone or Cote d'Ivoire. And, they had these enormous needs. And, if I were a woman living in that region who knew that there was at least a promise of safe childbirth, you can imagine why you would struggle over deciding what is the best way to move forward. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I think that's something that's why I'm concerned about certain kinds of distinctions being made. So, certainly in the period of plantation slavery in the U.S., the so much of medicine, particularly in the South, was about only sustaining the African enslaved African laborers so that they could keep working, and that was about it. It wasn't not about anything remotely resembling care. In the era past the blocking of the international slave trade, then reproduction is a major issue, but it's only to reproduce, children who will be fit to be laborers. And this becomes, I think we have to really do much harder work on how certain kinds of ideas like this become so deeply sedimented in medical and public health practices. And to think that we can just blink our eyes and say that we've walked away from them is not the way to undo these ideas, and such that, certainly in COVID, one of the things I was struck by was in a conversation the other day, was very early on, I was looking at a news show, and it was in Atlanta, and they were looking at it, they were talking to white communities outside of Atlanta. So, they're predominantly white communities outside of Atlanta. And people there kept saying, oh, we don't have to worry about this new disease because, there's no Black people here, or we can just keep, certain kind of workers out. And we don't have to worry about it because they're not going to come here. They actually thought that they had some kind of created some impermeable boundary around themselves just because they were a white community and they didn't, not many Black people or any Black people, the way they were talking, live there, and it was going to stay in Atlanta. Disease was going to stay in Atlanta. It was not going to creep out to them. And I just thought, I can't believe this is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
That there's some, that whiteness offers some whiteness and place offers some kinds of barrier. That's the same, that it's containment. Containment is so much in the present mind that somehow infectious diseases can be contained and controlled, but it's the containment and control of Black and brown peoples that protect whiteness and white people from the ravages of these diseases. And that to me was also just a serious backdrop in your story, Gregg.
Yeah, and absolutely. Just if you, just look at the physical geography of the way in which the plantations were structured, and where white management housing was always built on hills, because mosquitoes wouldn't go that high, and there was a separation from workers, which were built, the worker housing, which was built down in the swamps, and also a different malaria drugs being used for domestic workers in management housing, because they were, it was all about containment, right? Of possibilities of infection of malaria from domestic servants. So in the Firestone manuals, like that's like the number one thing is how to protect white management health, and it's all about containment, right, of Liberian laborers, both domestic servants and those working out on the plantations. And I think what you say, Evelynn, about these continuities, these long continuities of, and is it the nature of the plantation as a formation? I mean, or is it the history of American, not just American medical care, obviously, but Western medical care, and how do these all come together in the ways that we have these enduring continuities, and the ways in which it's so hard. I mean, Paul, you're the hero in really kind of pushing a social medicine agenda, and and there's been a history of this, of course, and yet it's so hard to really institute that, and also to think about, like, this is also less costly, right?
Way less costly. One of the weird things for me working there now and in Sierra Leone is, sometimes when you're like gearing up for an argument about the necessity to leaven, at the very least, control with care, I found myself battering down wide open doors, the authorities, and the authorities I work with, as you might imagine, are mostly in the Ministry of Health, meaning the health arena. They're like, bring it on. So in some ways, in spite of this devastating history that you've laid out so clearly, and I'm sure the folks at Firestone, some of them would agree with me now, meaning how Firestone is today. But, you really don't need rocket science or a Harvard expedition to point out how you would put in place the basics of a decent healthcare system in Liberia. The numbers are stunning. There are probably, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I would bet you that there are fewer than 100 practicing clinicians, and I've taught like 20 of them already. So that's a very small number, who are actually seeing patients every day in Liberia. It's such a tiny number now, in spite of the dream of Liberia in the 19th century and some of the promise in the early 20th century, in which I know is hard to find, but there's some promise there nonetheless, because it was devised as an experiment against, white rule and against colonial rule, which was white rule. So, I'm sympathetic, and I get W.B. Du Bois now more than I did, but it would be so simple to make a big difference. You need staff, you need stuff, you need space, space like hospitals, you need systems, you need support for the patients and their caregivers.
Mhm.
And so these are not, like, it's not some blindingly tall cultural wall or any of the things that we hear. It's really, there is a material insufficiency there that could be really readily, addressed. And I don't know inside the Firestone plantations what it's like, but outside on the outskirts, in the same region, by the way, you just see there's still no staff, doctors, nurses, there's still no stuff, antibiotics or surgical gear, whatever. The hospitals are a mess, but all these things could be fixed rather rapidly. And, we've looked to the diaspora, we've looked to various sympathetic parties, but it really needs to be, really entrenched in the state, in the firms, as you said. And I also learned from you, Gregg, that so many of these Liberian firms are foreign owned. So, I mean, I wouldn't have known that. I knew Firestone was foreign owned, but it was 3 out of 5 Liberian firms, by the time that Tubman became president. So anyway, I'm an optimist, and I need to be for my mental health, as Evelynn knows. I'm an optimist because it's so simple, and Firestone could have done it, and the Harvard expedition could have done a lot more, but you have to leaven the control with care. That's what people are looking for in Liberia as elsewhere. When they're sick or injured, they want to be cared for. They don't want to be controlled. So again and again, you've had this clash between the controlling powers and everybody else. And, I work mostly with the everybody else. So, I hear this very grim view of things, but nobody believes it's out of reach. I don't think.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe that pivots us nicely to a couple of questions from the audience. And I'm going to do some combining here to keep it streamlined. A first question from Charles Tripp for Dr. Farmer. Charles understands from the media during the Ebola epidemic that Firestone Bridgestone was actually quite effective at controlling the disease within their leased lands. Were those reports accurate or self-serving?
Well, I as far as I know, I don't have reason to question them. You could say, well, there's a hermeneutic of suspicion you should apply to anything that comes out of Firestone. I don't do that. We can weigh the value of the data as it comes in. I actually don't believe that's false, because after all, they could marshal the staff, space, systems, and support that would be needed to both prevent the spread, aka control. I mean, who doesn't want disease control? Everybody wants that. But at the expense of care, it just doesn't work. It amplifies trust, amplifies mistrust and violence. And throughout the epidemic from 2014 to the present, which it lasted for a couple of years, but I mean, all the way up to the day, it's to divert people away from being mistrustful. What do you need to do? Well, how about humbly showing them that you will provide medical care as a nurse or a doctor or whatever, community health worker? The more we did that, which is kind of why we went in there, we had the less trouble we had. And I believe, the settler regimes in Liberia of the 19th century and beyond, they would have done better had they done that. The colonial regimes of the late 18th century in Sierra Leone and beyond, they would have done better, but they never really did break that mold. So when and if Firestone broke that mold, and I bet they did, it doesn't surprise me at all that they have improved quality of outcomes in the areas where they were. I would add one other thing, that, writing from, and I wrote some of this recent book that Gregg was so kind about in Harper, but when writing from there, it's such a weird, it's so beautiful to be there, but it is really cut off from the rest of the world, including the rest of Liberia. So not a lot of Ebola cases got into some of these isolated regions. And what were we isolated by? Rubber trees. So I'm just saying, yeah, we're in a forest, but it was mostly a rubber forest. And, so I didn't personally, Gregg, go and inspect, what was going on, although it was all around there. But I didn't really doubt it, that but it took a very limited amount of staff, space, systems, and support to actually care for patients with Ebola, which is the only thing the Liberians were asking from us. I'm sure other people were saying, please control the epidemic so it doesn't spread to me. But the people I saw were, of course, already afflicted, or their family members were. And just a modicum of decent care. And you had so much gratitude, of course, but also, protection, respect, people protecting us. Like I said, it's a very volatile place, Liberia, but we did not experience that as long as we were providing care for patients.
Yeah, if I could just build on that too, because I was in, I was in Liberia. I was in at the start of the outbreak in June of 2014 when the first cases appeared in Redemption Hospital. And again, I don't have any reason to doubt Firestone's claims here, but as you know, Paul, I mean, getting into the plantations it's a gated community, right? So it's very easy to wall and close that off compared to Monrovia, right? Yeah. This capital city of 1.4 million people, where people are moving all the time, right? So the ability for Firestone to do that versus the Liberian government, it's a lot easier when you have controlled access in and out of the plantations. The other question that came as you were talking, I was wondering too. I mean, I haven't looked at the data on this, but I'm sure you have, and I suspect that more people died of malaria during the Ebola outbreak than Ebola, because I was getting Liberian friends that couldn't get their kids treated for malaria because it had the same symptoms, high fever and so forth, and they'd take their kids in and no one would come near them. And again, it shows that how this distinction between containment and care is.
One of the things, and I'll make this brief. I don't want to dominate in any way. One of the things that we saw in West Africa, and you saw throughout the period, was this control over care mania, right? And also the post-colonial reflections with the Americans helping Liberia most, and the British helping Sierra Leone, and I could put quotation marks around that, but I don't want to yet. And the French in Guinea. There were all these troubling colonial resonances, of course, but what we really felt was that as long as there was a control over care paradigm at work, one of the astounding things to me is that the amount of resources actually allocated for care were so much less than were advertised by the donor nations as the post-colonial powers now call themselves. I mean, it was, people talked about billions of dollars going into Ebola care, but look in Liberia at all the Ebola treatment units, the purpose-built units, which cost over $300 million of American taxpayer money. They never saw a single patient, most of them. Because by then it was over, and we're saying, no, we have to work with the local communities and in the Ministry of Health facilities and wherever there is Ebola. So Firestone and walling itself off, remotely in the 20s and 30s and beyond, I'm sure they did the population inside that forest a service as far as Ebola is concerned. Right. But as you said, Gregg, what about the everyday injuries, malaria, childbirth shouldn't be an injury, but you know what I mean? Trauma on the road or trauma in your mind, all that, because the curve was not flattened, all that was swept away during the height of the epidemic, and not just in Liberia, but in Sierra Leone and Guinea as well.
Yeah, but Paul, would you argue that the ways in which containment over care plays itself out is it introduces a different kind of economic calculus here, because if you, I think most of us, I'm like this long, faraway observer, but it's like as you noted, the care, it doesn't cost the same. Why keep paying? Why avoid care, and then at crisis, sort of go after the whatever virus has decided that it's gonna, it's found a niche in to bring us to crisis. And then we do that, and then we forget about care again.
I know. I mean, I don't think it makes economic logic, which is why I keep going back to the historians, saying, what is this logic? before it was neoliberal logic, it was what? It was colonial logic,
Right.
and that's why I'm so enamored of the work. Well, I'm enamored of Gregg's work, but I'm enamored of social histories in general, because how are we going to understand the logic that's hobbling us right now in the middle of a COVID crisis? We're not even really aware of the costs that we paid just in terms of the dead, in the United States, certainly. But it just seems wrong-headed to me to not try and look for the logic behind the paradigms, which again, I think
Yeah.
Gregg has done so beautifully in this book. It's sorted, and in other work, I might say before the book came out, it just, if you go into Liberia as a complete novice in your 50s, no matter how much you know about another part of Africa or Haiti or anywhere, it's really this kind of work, Gregg, and I would just want to say it as a flat out praise to you and your ilk. This is the way that we should be learning about what's going on. Look at social anthropology, which doesn't always tell you a lot about social history. So then go to social history. And I feel like, and I'll just say this, as I've said to Evelynn before, and many of her students who are my colleagues and students sometimes, is without the kind of perspectives offered by social history in the way that you write it, I don't think we'd really have been as able to respond effectively. And I think we did respond effectively. We're not proud of,
Mhm.
the quality of the work, because we should have lost so few people. I think, others still object inside medical. It's like, oh, Ebola is so virulent, nobody's going to live, everybody's going to die. Well, they used to say that about strep, staph, HIV, the list goes on.
Mhm.
So I just really want to say to the historians present, that's really the message I give my medical students, is you want to learn about a place, go back to social histories. Sorry, I feel like I'm doing an advertisement for the American Historical Association.
Well, we have just a minute to close, and I was actually just going to refer our audience to a place to buy the book. So that was a perfect platform for me. Dr. Farmer, thank you.
Thank you.
So I think, just in the interest of respecting everyone's time, we're in our final few seconds here. I will do that. This book just published this month, Empire of Rubber. And as an independent publisher, we typically refer people to bookshop.org. And you can find it there. You can find Evelynn's excellent work there, Paul's work there as well. And that refers the sales out to independent booksellers across the United States. So I just want to thank everybody for a really extraordinary conversation, and particularly to all our hosts and institutional co-sponsors that made this possible. And congratulations, of course, to Gregg on the publication of his book.
Thank you. And thank you so much for engaging in this conversation. I couldn't have thought of a better dream team to be in conversation with about this book. So I really appreciate the time you've taken out. I know you're very, very busy lives, and
well, thank you for this work. It's really, I can't say, I'm with Paul. It's a really amazing story that we all have to pay attention to. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gregg.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.